Take a seat, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. Take your seats, please, everyone. Hi.
I'm trying to.
Okay, before we start the next session, I just have a few things to say. Obviously, on-site hasn't been working for us terribly well. The network doesn't support Speedy, which is the main problem that we're having, unfortunately. So we're going to put it on the screens anyway because it helps you, I guess, to see who's currently speaking. But it's not helping to put yourself in the queue, so just stick your hand up. And actually, I think that's it. So we now have a session on accessibility. Chris Heelman from Mozilla is moderating this one. Over to you, Chris.
So yeah, here's the panel that you've been waiting for after we had it hinted in every other panel so far, and lots of questions and lots of quick solutions being thrown around. Like the last session, for example, when will voice recognition be the norm? Just easy, take people's eyes out, takes their arms off, and they have to use voice recognition. A lot of things that we actually think is coming had to be used in accessibility for years and years already. I always see accessibility as a hardcore usability testing. It's something that people need and not something that we just want to have. But Derek is going to do a better job in that. My job is right now not to talk, but to introduce people. So to first make fun of the Germans that have a family name like Luthwaite, Sarah is here. She's from King's College, and she's an academic researcher and writer bridging the gap between critical disability theory and accessibility practice, something that was on our mind for a long, long time, and we've been discussing a lot in between us, hopefully. Andrew Rongsley over here is from the RNIB, and he's an accessibility and usability specialist focused on the web and mobile platforms. He's also contributed to the Serve Right standards, which is an interesting thing to look at. Alice Boxhall is from Google, but she knows about accessibility, and okay, that was unfair, but it was so good because everybody else I talked to, she's like, and here's Alice. She's going to talk to you later about accessibility, so no pressure. You have to answer all the questions right now. She works on the accessibility developer tools, extension, and library, and that's something like we used in the past. We had performance tools for developer tools, but now we have accessibility testers in there as well, which are great and absolutely necessary for things like a Chromebook, where you only have Chrome on it and nothing else. And Matthew Tiley Atkinson from the Paciello group over there is from the Paciello group, a tester, screen magnifier, and occasional text-to-speech user. And he works on web accessibility, accessible gaming, which is an interesting topic, especially when you think about these kind of Kinect things, level editing, and supporting older users. Older users, is that a politically correct term? I'm not sure. So speaking of people that have been around for a longer time, I'm going to introduce you now to Derek Featherstone, who has been with me in the accessibility world for a long, long time and worked on the first book that we both had chapters in, the web accessibility book that 2 or 4 people read and followed up later on. So without further ado, over to Derek.
So I'm here today to talk about accessibility, and most people think of accessibility in very technical terms. And the number one point that I want everybody to walk away from this today with is that accessibility is all about people. It has to be about people, because if it's not about people, we end up doing the wrong thing, even though we're meaning to do the right thing. So all of us that are up here have a background in doing this stuff for people. So Christian actually started his first foray into understanding accessibility was when he was working with people with disabilities when he worked for the Red Cross. Sarah is a researcher. She actually works with real people on accessibility issues. Alice is putting ARIA support into Chrome, and that's for people to use, right? We cannot forget this. Andrew actually works with people, taking smartphones to them to show them and demonstrate all the different accessibility features of smartphones and how those things can actually have an impact on their day-to-day life. And Matthew started changing the authoring environment for gaming so that that could be so that could be accessible to people that were blind. And I do too. I work with people with accessibility, with disabilities every day. We do research and testing and try to figure out what UX is for people with disabilities, right? What does UX mean to them? And so hearing all of the things that everybody's talking about this morning and this afternoon has been absolutely fascinating, because we're talking about it at very technical levels, but at the end of the day, people have to use those tools. And that, to me, is what accessibility is all about. We tend to simplify things, and you probably have heard of all of these different conditions or things that people have, that people are blind, or they have low vision, they have hearing difficulties, or that they have a mobility or a dexterity impairment. And when you start to think of all of these things, even those things seem to be very physical, but what about the cognitive side of things? And those are traditionally the things that we're thinking about when we think about accessibility. But there's a whole other realm that we need to start to get into and explore. How many of you have heard of things like vestibular disorders? So there's a whole group of people that have some kind of vestibular disorder, and I don't even like the word disorder, but issues with their balance. And so when they're looking at a screen with all your fancy CSS animations and your parallax effects, that actually makes them nauseous, right? It actually causes migraines. So when we have, when you're scrolling down a page and you have a car that you've animated with CSS that's going like this across the page, that actually makes somebody nauseous. Right? These are new things that aren't sort of in mainstream accessibility, and we need to start to take those things into account. Things like speech. The very last panel was talking about, well, what about speech? And as Christian pointed out, voice recognition software was originally invented for people with disabilities. So on the speech side of things, and this is I think an absolutely critical thing for us to keep in mind as we move forward. Speech is just one modality, right? What happens if we create interfaces that use that as the only modality? And what does that do for somebody that speaks a different language, that has a stutter, that maybe has cerebral palsy and has difficulty speaking, right? We need to create interfaces that are entirely flexible. And one of the other panels earlier, the pointers. What about custom gestures? Well, what about the fact that, and so here's a custom gesture, move up and to the left. Well, that custom gesture is already being used on Android for screen reader users that are using the TalkBack screen reader on Android. So what happens when that custom gesture that you've created and built into your page conflicts with the custom gesture that is required for the screen reader? So we need to think about flexible alternatives. So when I move up and left in TalkBack in Android, that means something to me and that gives me functionality. So even though you create a custom gesture like that in your app or in your page, you need to consider that maybe that's not the only way that we should be able to instantiate that action. Maybe we need some other method or a backup mechanism to do that. We need to think about all of these different things. We tend to put people in boxes and say you're blind or you're not blind, right? You have a disability or you don't. But that is not reality. We have a scenario, and this is a very standard Gaussian binomial bell curve distribution, whatever you want to call it. And we have people that live at one end of the extreme or another. And this one's talking about people's size, but think of it in terms of any ability. So you have people on one end that have maybe completely normal vision, on the other end, people that have no vision, and then you have people everywhere in between. This is not a binary all or nothing scenario, and we need to think about that all the time. Today's assistive technology is really advanced. We've moved from a point where solutions that we used to think were completely untenable, like ARIA. So ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, and it's a tool that we can use to add to our code to provide programmatic accessibility where it just didn't exist before. Screen readers over the last 5 years have really advanced and really done a great job of getting ARIA support into that technology. But we have to ask this kind of a question. What if a brand new version of a certain type of assistive technology just isn't modern? And I'll give you an example. This is a suite of assistive technology tools. We've got voice recognition up there. We've got tools built into browsers. NV Access is a screen reader for the Windows platform that's free, VoiceOver on the Mac, Zoom Text on Windows as a magnifier and reader combination. Now, all of the screen readers on there, they have done a pretty good job of keeping up with modern technology. But some other tools don't necessarily keep up. And so I'm not going to name any names or single anybody out, but Dragon Naturally Speaking is a great tool, but it doesn't keep up with the standards. They haven't implemented any support for ARIA, and that's something that all the screen readers have done. I'll give you an example of why that's actually important. This is a very, very new version of a Google map, and these things on the interface, the search button and the zoom in and the zoom out, those things all used to be divs with on-click handlers, right? Pretty straightforward practice, very typical. This is something where we could actually improve that by giving it a div with a role. Instead of just having a div with an on-click, we could actually give that a role of button so that a screen reader or other piece of assistive technology, in theory, could recognize that that's a button, so that there's a more natural affordance there that, hey, I can actually click on this instead of it just being a div in the page. The beautiful thing about this is that, and I just literally saw this with this new revision of Google Maps, they're actually now buttons, like actual buttons. Holy crap, they're actually buttons. And that totally gets a gold star, because all the semantics of a button are already in that native element, right? This button could be used by Dragon Naturally Speaking. The div with a role of button can't be, right? So there's a question about whose responsibility is this. There's a lot of people that are pointing the finger at Dragon and saying, you guys are wrong. And I want you to think about this. From an ARIA perspective, this is the last time I stayed in London, I had this in my hotel room. This was a king-size bed. And so I had a sleep apparatus with the role of king-size bed, but it was two twins with a break in the middle. Now, I complained. I'm Canadian. I don't complain, so this was a big deal to me. So I complained, and I got a new room, and I got a new bed. And so in that bed, I had a sleep apparatus, and it was a king with a class of posh. Thought everything was great until I dug a little further. And I had a sleep apparatus with a roll of king-size bed, two twins with a break, but the break was styled to be display none. If you remember nothing else about ARIA, remember that what's under the sheets actually matters, right? The tools and the code that you use actually have a huge impact on how assistive technology can interpret it and work with it, right? So thinking about those kinds of things and thinking about Dragon and how it works, is it our job to be responsible, even though we have a tool like ARIA that could really change your app? Do we have a responsibility to make some better choices and actually use things like real buttons or just better code in general? My vote is yes, but you'll find that out in the next little while. The other thing that people are asking quite a lot about these days is stuff about detecting assistive technology. And I want to know, and as a developer, you probably want to know, I've heard it all morning. I'd really like to know, is this HTTP 1, is it HTTP 2, is it whatever? Do we have the capability to know? And my question to you is, if you could detect a screen reader, what would you even do with that information? And there's some real slippery slopes that we go down when we do that kind of stuff and say, and I'll give you one example and then I'll shut up. If we use a screen reader, if we detect a screen reader, we might inject a whole bunch of extra hidden headings that give some extra context to a screen reader user, which is kind of a neat idea. I think there's some merit to that. But we have to remember that the only people that use screen readers aren't just blind. Right? There's all kinds of people that use screen readers for literacy reasons. And what's the impact on them if they have a learning difficulty if you're having a screen reader read hidden headings that they can't see on the page? Right? So we need to think bigger. We'll address a lot of those kinds of questions and more during the panel. Thank you.
Splendid. So we're back to bed components instead of web components. Not bad. So we have a lot of experts here. We have 7 questions that we cut down on. I'm supposed to get these questions on some list here, but that's not showing up at the moment. What's going on there? So, oh. Yeah, it's a tablet. Look at that. Wonderful. Touch interface. And really small and not resizable. OK, so the first question that we have was supposed by Andrew Betts, but he doesn't want to do it. So Melanie Lang.
So it is. What are the main offenders of modern websites in terms of accessibility? Okay. What are the main offenders of modern websites in terms of accessibility, and what can be done to fix that?
So the question is, like, in many cases as web developers, we do things that look beautiful, and it's a barrier for accessibility without us even knowing it. So I think we're going to send that off to Matthew. So Matthew, what have you seen in your day-to-day browsing that drives you nuts, although people think it's amazing?
There's a few things. I'm sure that there's going to be many examples from the rest of the panel, but I suppose a personal bugbear for me is disabling pinch to zoom on mobile sites, because that just renders them completely useless to me personally. I'm vision impaired. I can see well enough to use the device, but only if I've got control over the size of things on it. So that's a personal one. I think something to bear in mind is that somebody that's using an assistive technology to browse a website, say, for example, a screen reader, but it isn't limited to just a screen reader, they can only perceive one element at a time. So they go through the whole thing, one element by the next element, until they get to the end. And a lot of stuff in accessibility is providing information such that the assistive technology can help the user get to the bit of the page they want to get to as quickly as possible. So a lot of stuff is about saving the user time and making sure that the structure of a page is conveyed, the semantics are conveyed, so that the user saves time and can get to the bit they need. So things like lack of skip links, lack of headings. Visually, you can see the layout beautifully, but there's just no semantic information or no structural information there. That's very frustrating, because it might actually be, with the trend on modern sites is towards things like simpler language, fewer words on the page, more focused. You know, it could be really good, but sometimes people forget the basics, which is just make sure that you use HTML headings and lists and stuff like that, ARIA, if necessary, and native controls where possible. So things that save people time. And there was also an article I read recently about things that just have to go away. Things like when you're asked to enter a credit card number and you're asked, what type of credit card is it? And please remember to put the dashes in, or don't put dashes in, or put spaces in, or, you know, telling the user to do this stuff. Okay, for all of us, that's really annoying. It shouldn't be necessary. It's just a number. But for accessibility, people facing extra accessibility barriers, that sort of stuff, having to go back and correct it because the instructions weren't necessarily there or correct, that can really take a lot of time, and it's very frustrating.
So it's going back to like using sensible HTML, building things the way they used to work. I remember when browsers were bad, you had to use the right HTML, or otherwise they wouldn't show up, because there was no CSS. So to a degree, we then use tables for different weird things, but that's a different story. So Alice, the shockingly innovative way of using buttons instead of divs with on-click handlers, do you have to fight for these kind of things? Is there a way that developers are actually assuming that things work in the browser because the browser fixes it for them? And do we have to remind people how to make things accessible?
Well, if you're using standard widgets, by and large, it should be accessible. One of the big problems we see is that people just simply aren't using the standard widgets. And yeah, I would very much like to understand why. My hypothesis is that you can't style them the way you want. So two problems. One, you can't style them the way you want, or they don't behave the way you want. So one thing I would like to see is making it easier to style custom elements the way that we want to. It's quite difficult today. It's a very simple problem to solve, I think. Secondly, make it easier for developers to actually apply that ARIA metadata semantic information. How can we get that on the golden path that we've been talking about today, or the pit of success? How can we make that easier for developers? I think that Web Components possibly has a big role to play here, and I know that the team is working on that. Another idea would be to put it into the developer tools that we're all using. So how can we expose the accessibility information such that it's impossible to ignore?
Wouldn't it be better to make it harder to put ARIA on stuff?
How do you mean?
Well, ARIA is a great solution for screen readers, but it's not right now for Dragon. And I know in good conscience that I won't, we don't use ARIA unless we know that it's going to get really good support, and that we look for other ways to do things when we're building things. I almost would like to make it better to just use a button, than to add role equals button on something.
Yeah, I completely agree.
We're coming back to ARIA in an extra question later on, and I agree. It's a tricky thing to actually turn something into something that it isn't when there is something that is already something. But that's a different story. Andrew, what do you see as like crimes that are happening that actually make things inaccessible on mobile devices when people use HTML? I found it interesting, for example, that the unsightly select box that people hated on the desktop and always wanted to style is awesome on mobile devices.
Yeah, I think on mobile, I think Matthew's already covered it. The biggest one is disabling pinch to zoom. I've had so many users come to me with that problem. I'm asking, why does my pinch to zoom not work on this website? And it comes down to the way we're using the meta viewport tag, and we're all using it to kind of get rid of the 300 millisecond delay, which I guess in the past, my advice would be to developers, think about how you use that. But I guess now going forward, I'm thinking, should people like myself be getting more involved with browser vendors to say, okay, developers are doing this, is there a way that we can kind of cater for both scenarios rather than say to developers, don't do that? Is there a way that we can kind of, get this fixed through bugs with the browsers, basically? So that's probably the biggest one. I think on desktop, the best bit of advice I could give to you guys would be try using the things you build with a keyboard only. So just recently, I was working with someone who's having a huge problem with their online banking, where they couldn't complete a payment to somebody because it was using an overlay. And whoever had built that had clearly thought about the interaction with the mouse. Things behind the overlay were disabled, you couldn't click on them. But because this user was using the keyboard, their interaction was going wildly wrong. And if the developer had thought, okay, maybe what if someone's not using a mouse, they probably would have come up, found that problem quite quickly, and could have done something about it.
Cool. I'm very excited that Jake Archibald has a question, but we have to move on to the next topic. So Ross Green has a question for us.
I've got it.
You're not Ross Green.
I'm not Ross Green, but Ross Green is not attending, so has asked me to ask the question. And I'm also going to answer it, because I've got a microphone. Accessibility expectations and requirements are vastly different depending on the user's world region. What more could be done to align them? Example, most EU rules say don't autoplay media. However, most US media will autoplay. The answer is don't autoplay media. And a slight snark is, well, EU rules could be more widely promulgated if the EU government websites actually obeyed their own rules.
Okay.
But anyway, what could be done to align the different territories' regulations about accessibility?
So the good news is that this was hard to understand. The question is basically, there's twofold to that. There's differences between accessibility guidelines in Europe and in America, and you have to, for example, when you do government websites, when you do very much basic, any website that faces a lot of audience, you have to apply with them. You have to basically apply the rules, and are different from Europe to America. As this World Wide Web of us is worldwide, kind of confusing to which ones to follow. So are there ways to actually get the legal requirements more aligned with each other? So maybe Sarah, you could tell us something about that.
The thing I find interesting about this question is it refers to geography, which I think is really important. Obviously, we know devices vary, our tools vary, and so forth, but also it's worth understanding and thinking about how disability varies globally and internationally. So we've already heard a little bit about, say, the nature of disability and how we might want to conceptualize it. But it's worth also, I think, recognizing that disability means different things in different parts of the world, and levels and types of disability vary depending on where you are, by locale, region, as well as by nation. So personally, I think there's a bit of a tension in terms of picking a standard to apply in all situations. I think the great thing about WCAG is that it's a guideline, and when it's applied as a guideline, it allows perhaps for more of that indigenous reflection, the expertise of local developers to come into play as well. So they can account maybe for an indigenous population with lower literacy levels, or perhaps who have less assistive technologies. At the moment, there's not a great deal of data globally in terms of the kinds of technologies that disabled people are using. But obviously, WCAG in particular is being picked up because the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is being taken up by more and more countries. And people have this kind of policy vacuum in terms of information and communication technologies that are referred to in the UN Convention, and people want to make sure their sort of policy is picking that up. So WCAG is being applied more and more as the kind of verbatim standard. But I think there is a bit of a tension in terms of knowing what that means, say, in Nepal or Uganda, or more regionally.
It is kind of confusing because, I mean, being an ex-German developer and now living here, there's different guidelines even in Europe from country to country. So maybe in point of the RNIB, I guess you work with a lot of people that come to you and say, like, I don't want to be sued. What can I do for people with disabilities? Which is the awful, awful question we keep getting.
Yeah.
What is your answer to that? Like, how do you get people to understand that just applying with the law does not necessarily make an accessible interface?
So I think for me there is a business case behind accessibility, which we'll often talk to companies about, around some potential SEO benefits, potentially opening it up to new markets. And I think when I first got into that sector, or this sector, sorry, I really did believe in that business case, and I still do. But at the same time, it's a little bit theoretical because we don't have many case studies to back it up. So Derek's point about what if we could detect a screen reader? I think I'm with you, Derek. I don't think it's a good idea to detect a screen reader if you're going to do something with that information in terms of the website, but I'd really like that feature as part of analytics, so that we can say, okay, we made some changes to the website, and we can now see perhaps screen reader users are not dropping out midway through the process of checking out or something like that. So I'd really like that kind of stuff because we don't have many good case studies. So whilst we can say, yeah, maybe you're going to get more visitors, we don't have any figures really to back that up.
Yeah. Derek, you used to work on that for a long time as well, like back in Watts days and things with we had guidelines that said you have to have a certain kind of access key on the page, for example, and that was not enforceable or usable really.
Yeah, there's a lot of things you have to remember that, especially when you talk about guidelines, accessibility guidelines, and then talk about giving them the force of legislation. You're taking something that is designed to be necessarily fuzzy and putting it into something that becomes absolute black and white. And I would even respond to Bruce and say, we all said, everybody laughed. He said, well, the simple answer is do not autoplay. And I would counter that by saying that autoplay can actually be useful for certain types of people, including people that have mobility difficulties. It may be actually much easier for them if you do autoplay, so that when you go to a new video page, it actually does play for them. They don't have to try and work hard to actually get it to play. So when we're embedding a YouTube video or a whatever video on a site of ours, we always recommend have it embedded and don't autoplay that one, but also link to the YouTube page outside, because then the user has the preference to set it up so that my videos on YouTube always autoplay. So we're kind of catering for both things there. So the edicts like do not autoplay, they sound really good, but they don't necessarily always make sense. Autoplay is bad for everyone except for the people that need it.
Okay, we have a question from Christopher Imrie.
I just wanted to kind of chime in, just with regards to going on about differences between EU law and the US law. So the difference between the EU and US law, I just wanted to kind of, just with regards to my experience, I found that it's actually even more complicated because the requirements of accessibility don't just live in the government legislature. Like, for example, when you get to a client who reaches the level where they're now rolling out in different markets, they will then have their own accessibility requirements layer within that, which typically will be based off one market, even though they're rolling out locally. I mean, that's my experience, even though they're rolling out globally. So we've actually encountered situations whereby we're using, like, in one example, like the EU accessibility guidelines, even though we're rolling out in, the UAE or in China and things like that. And that becomes a very weird, strained situation because the document, a lot of times that the accessibility was kind of created at the company's end was to tick off the box to say, well, yes, we have accessibility guidelines, but they didn't roll it out to the market level. So I just wanted to say it's on top of the government legislature, there's the actual corporate layer as well.
It's a super tricky, all-in-all problem, and the issue is a lot of people try to sell accessibility as something you could be sued if you don't do it right, but then we don't have the answer how to do it right. It's like getting someone's attention by kicking them in the shins, like, yeah, you have their attention, but not their support. So Shane Hudson has a question for us on this, not kicking, but general. He's there, the man in the striped shirt.
So are the WCAG, I have trouble saying that, the guidelines redundant in a world of smartphones and tablets? Are accessibility laws trying to fix an outdated world? It's kind of been touched upon.
Yeah, kind of. So basically the question is the WCAG guidelines define a lot of stuff, for example, keyboard accessibility, which is on a touch device a bit of a weird thing to enforce. So do they need to be upgraded? Do we need to think about different form factors? I think the best would be Sarah, what do you think?
I think this is a problem with the nature of standards, and there's quite a lot of interesting writing about what standards do, sort of outside of development communities. So for example, they offer a fixed perspective, which is what I think some of us are struggling with, in the sense that disability is so heterogenic that it needs to sort of be as inclusive as possible, and a standard rather than a guideline is difficult. So I think, yeah, there are these problems about how it keeps abreast of new developments, which we can't necessarily foresee. But I think one of the things which I find interesting is that standards also convey certain values, and as I say, when they're being picked up internationally, there's it's useful to recognise that they also promote the rights of people with disabilities, and they promote their access to technology and raise a kind of whole argument about human rights, disability rights, which isn't necessarily reflected in all the communities that these standards touch upon. So that's one of the things I think which we need to also keep front and centre.
Matthew, in terms of gaming, I mean, the Paciello group does a great job in explaining on their blog how to apply WCAG guidelines, how to apply best technologies, and most people start with a blank canvas with no keyboard accessibility whatsoever for their game. So do you think that the WCAG is outdated? Are we fixing the web from 1997 rather than the web from 2005?
A couple of things. First of all, the gaming stuff is separate to my TPG stuff, but I'm very happy to talk about it, of course.
You don't get fired, don't worry.
Sarah made a really good point last night, which I just wanted to make sure came up, which is that a screen reader could be a person next to you reading what's on the screen in a particular place. You were saying about different countries have different social views of accessibility and different access to ATs, and therefore screen reader detection would have to encompass reading glasses and people sat next to you as well, and both of these at the same time, perhaps. Anyway, moving on to answering the actual question. A couple of points. One of them is that if you look at WCAG, and there's a lot to read, but the central points that it's trying to get across and the values that Sarah mentioned, they're actually written down in there. They are the core principles that your content needs to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And you can look up what those are, but you get the general idea. You can apply those kind of principles to any medium. Now, some of the WCAG stuff might be less appropriate on mobile, some of the very specific technical stuff, but a lot of the guidelines, in fact, well, all of them are written with those 4 principles in mind, and you can apply those to any medium. So in terms of game accessibility, that is about making sure that you know what information is important to someone to be able to play this game, what is the best way to present it to the particular audience that you're thinking about. In our case, it was blind people, so it was making a lot of visual cues auditory instead. Understandable, it's got to be understandable to be able to be enjoyable in the case of a game, and in the case of a banking website, it's got to be understandable in order to be able to use it. And robust, that covers the kind of security and reliability stuff on the website side of things, and on the game side of things, you don't want it to crash just before you're going to complete the level. So very briefly, that is a very glib, high level, trying to demonstrate you can apply these things to multiple areas.
So Alice, when you put that into the developer tools accessibility panel, I mean, those of us who have been in accessibility long enough remember Bobby approved and people putting like AAA badges on their website, which ironically didn't have an alternative text. What are the testing tools that you have in there? Do you get like, this doesn't apply with that guideline, or is it more of a transcription of the perceivable and the ideas of it? Because it's easy for a developer to say like, oh, I'm now accessible because I tick all the boxes, but what does it really mean? What kind of a test tool would help people there?
So one point that I always try to make with the accessibility developer tools is that passing mechanical accessibility audit does not in any way guarantee that you're completely accessible. It's only looking at the things that we can test programmatically, which is a subset. That said, what it does look at are things like color contrast. It tries to look for click targets and suggest that you should use an ARIA role and keyboard handling. It also looks for valid ARIA use. So those are sort of the main things that it's looking at. But one point I did want to make just to follow on is that the robust in perceivable, operable, understandable, robust actually encapsulates working in different modalities, which actually implies that it should work on different devices. So when we're talking about mobile, tablet, even something like Google Glass or a TV or a Leap, robust encapsulates all of that.
Good. Matthew, you had a question, or you're pulling it? She covered everything you do. I just wanted to show that somebody from Google has something to say about accessibility.
No, I was going to ask, like, is there any, since you're all there,
have you here.
I once made a comment about changing an outline in CSS and basically changing the background color for the focus. I got slated immediately on Twitter for this. It's not accessible. And I'm fine with that. And I'm kind of like, well, what is the right way to do it? And there's a part of me that's like, well, can I apply filters to my site that says, this is what a screen reader will see? Or, like, what should I be doing in my workflow that basically helps me as a developer make my site more accessible, I guess? Are there tools? Is there some things you'd recommend? Or is it just a case of use native components, use the accessibility thing, and use that?
So
Derek?
using, and I'll, 75% of all statistics are made up. So you can get probably
Two out of 7 people know that.
Yeah. you can get 80 to 90% of the way accessible by testing everything with a keyboard, and you have to manually test that because that's interaction. There's no way to test it other than that. But dealing with like straight up good solid semantic markup, that using just writing good HTML and not screwing up keyboard access gets you 80 to 90% of the way there. Straight up, honest truth. Now, using it with the keyboard is going to show you stuff about your outline changes, right? You're going to go through and you're going to say, shit, I can't see the cursor. I have no idea where I am.
So
I have to stop this cursing right now, actually, and this is a longer topic that we could go on. So I'm moving on to actually Ed Soden, which is actually covering this a bit. So Ed Soden has a question.
I'm reading this one.
Yeah, Mr. Soden.
Was I not allowed to say?
So as developers, we often try and make our sites work well for screen readers. But is there anything else we can do besides screen readers when we're designing our sites to make them better for accessibility?
That is an incredibly interesting question that we haven't quite covered yet, or just did, or tried. So, Andrew, what do you think? The big screen reader debate. Every developer I talk to, like, it works with a screen reader because that's something I can test with. What else should we be thinking about?
No, it's a great question, and I could make up some stats now, but I'm not going to.
Go ahead.
In the UK, there's around 2 million people that have some kind of site-related issue, and the vast majority of those have some residual useful vision. So the thing you can take away from that is quite a small percentage of those 2 million people are using a screen reader. The rest of them are making some kind of visual adaptations to the page. And I think you can extrapolate that to around the world issues. So I think around the world it's something like 280 million people have some site-related issue. So things that you can do that are not related to a screen reader, and this, it kind of applies to all of us. You think about using a website out and about, color contrast, the size of your font, how much white space is between controls. So someone who's using a screen magnifier, I'll see sites sometimes where there's a form and maybe there's 2 buttons at the end, next and previous. They're really far apart from each other. If someone's using a screen magnifier, I think Matt kind of touched on this before. It's a little bit different with a screen magnifier, but you see a portion of the screen at any one time. Those of you that everyone pretty much has Macs here, you'll all have a screen magnifier built in, Windows as well. So you can try this out if you want. Another way to think about it is if you imagine like sliding a credit card around your screen, just imagine that was your viewport. So if the buttons are far apart, you know, there's potential to miss them. So just that kind of stuff is worth thinking about, and that's nothing to do with screen readers at all.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. I love the credit card thing. I didn't think about that yet. My favorite is always when people, now everything comes with screen readers, which is great for accessibility for people, but it also is kind of bad because developers think they know how these things work now. The amount of people I see using a screen reader with their eyes open is amazing. And that defeats the purpose, because of course you can understand your system. So James Abley has a question, or was that already about the last topic?
Yeah, that was about the last topic.
Okay, good. So do you have another one?
Maybe we need to be more creative and maybe go back to roots and test. I don't know. Headscape, for example, they tested a site for old people with, I think they put Vaseline on glasses and put gloves on to simulate arthrosis.
Yeah.
So maybe, do we need to go back and just do that maybe and go this extra mile?
Testing this kind of way works. I mean, I gave people broken mice to actually use the website, for example, with.
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of things that you can do like that to, you know, to simulate different types of disability, and I believe that all of those things are great, you know, emulating what a user with a particular type of disability would be. You want to see what it's like for somebody that has a tremor in their hand to use use a mouse. Turn your mouse sideways and try to manipulate it on the screen, and you'll you know, or use the wrong hand. There's all kinds of things that you can do. The one thing that I would point out, and I think those are great things to do. The WCAG guidelines are designed specifically because we know, and I say we like I was involved or something, but we can't all go and test with real people, and so those guidelines are all in place because they're based on years and years of people actually working with people with disabilities, so that those are, if you like, absolutely valuable and useful, and everybody should do it. But if you can't do that, then you have guidelines as your sort of first point of advice, and I absolutely go back to it. But if you can't, just feel at least partially confident that those guidelines are there to replace the fact that everybody can't do that.
Actually, I feel I completely understand where you're coming from, but I also feel that's a bit of a cop-out in terms of I think sometimes standards step in and people want to learn the standard because that's the easy thing to do, and they want to turn their mouse sideways and do that, when sometimes they have disabled populations sitting right under their nose. So, for example, in the university sector, there are hundreds of disabled students at King's College London. How many are involved in testing our systems? You know, they're right there. We could easily engage with them. So I think it's important to be creative and think about, you know, drawing people into this conversation. So if you're doing usability testing at large, don't be afraid of, contacting, say, disabled people's organisations or putting a call out for people to get involved in testing your systems, because they will give you much richer feedback about how your interfaces work, and they're going to bring up things that you just would not have imagined possible.
It would be interesting to see if what kind of, I mean, you can take the glasses away from your colleagues, for example, or you can read out your text on the screen to somebody on the phone. If it then makes sense, you know it's an accessible text. If you need the thing to see to understand it, then you don't. Like, there's a lot of, would be interesting to set up a wiki or something about these like little accessibility hacks to simulate different things, but outreach to real people with real disabilities, hardcore users that know how to use something, is amazing. I mean, I learned most working next to a PHP developer who was blind for like 4 years, and that was just incredible because he coded faster than me, which is annoying. Now, with a sense of dread, Patrick Lauke has a question.
No, I haven't got a question. I've got a lengthy statement now. Just a quick note. I wanted to pick up just on something that was mentioned at the start there about I did something to my outline and I was immediately jumped upon by an accessibility lynch mob. The dirty kind of truth, even within the Paciello group, I can say that hopefully openly, is that you get 3 accessibility experts, you get 5 different opinions. We disagree even on sometimes very fundamental things, like very first guideline of WCAG, having appropriate alt text. We could have discussions for days about what is the most appropriate alt text for this? And you'll get fierce debates in the accessibility community about every image should have this kind of alt, or no image should have alt. And so just wanted to kind of temper the whole, when you get people jumping on you and immediately shouting, oh, that's not accessible, they may be right or they may not be right. And as Derek mentioned towards the start, is that it is not a binary thing. It's not always, it's either accessible or inaccessible. There's certainly things that you can do that completely screw everybody over that can't see the screen perfectly and use a mouse. But beyond that, there's lots of shades of gray on that one.
Yeah, also stop arguing on Twitter. 140 characters are not good to actually bring emotions or facts in. We've got Nikhil Verma here, because Christopher has said too many things already.
So basically, I did a bit of a stat check, and I checked that there are about 2.7 million people in Britain who have color blindness, and haven't seen that mentioned in this talk yet. Do we consider people who are colorblind to be disabled, or are there any things that people generally can do to improve their pages to prove that they look for colorblind?
Did you say stable?
I met a few unstable colorblind people in my past, but I think your tools, Alice. I mean, you talked about like the color distance, but also color blindness as one of these simulators in there, isn't it?
No, not in my tool actually.
Well, that can be fixed.
There are, sure, you want to send me a patch? There are extensions certainly for Chrome, probably for other browsers as well, which will simulate color blindness. And contrast ratio is also has a color blindness implication in that, say if you have like red on white, if you view that as gray, it may not be high enough contrast ratio.
Derek, you were twitching?
Well, a little. There's a great tool, Color Oracle, which you can install at the desktop level, and it will transform everything. And you can simulate things. It doesn't, the 2 challenges with color blindness, and I'm saying this in a very blanket statement, so there's probably more challenges. But one is the color contrast issue. The other is the way that you're using color to convey information, right? If you're relying on color, then you need to. We're not saying don't rely on color. Use color as much as you want, but use other mechanisms to indicate things as well. So it could be, that you're using pattern with color, or instead of just using color, think of a line graph that has a legend at the bottom. Instead of putting the legend at the bottom, change your graph so that each one of the individual legend pieces is actually up beside the line, so that you can then follow the line.
This also ties into internationalization. My favorite is when people just use red as a warning, whereas in China it means good luck. Good luck, we lost all your emails. Wonderful. So, oh God, lots of questions. So let's have one here. The man in the loud shirt.
Sorry about my shirt. I was just thinking, we've talked a lot today about web performance and things like that, and about how does the whole performance piece fit into accessibility? Obviously, what I'm kind of coming to mind is things being too fast, where we're constantly working to speed things up. You know, is there cases in accessibility where we actually need to slow it down?
So, you know, I had a few thoughts when listening to all the other performance things, and one of the things that I heard was, you know, what's in the first 15 kilobytes? And I started to think, you know, what should be in the first 15 kilobytes for somebody that has a particular type of disability? And I don't know the answer to that question. I think that's a great one. I'm not sure about slowing things down. You know, most technology, most screen reading technology and other technologies, they work on top of browsers. They're not their own thing, generally speaking. So
I think where I'm kind of coming from is about the thought of perception. If something changes on the screen too quickly, and it becomes harder for visually impaired people to actually detect that change, you know.
So are you talking about in response to some event that's happened on the page, or like an initial load, or?
These are more like UX problems, isn't it? I think like drop-down menu. Yeah.
Yeah, something. Yeah, just a case of stuff changing, either naturally in a carousel, which is kind of automated, or in response to an action.
Yeah. So on a carousel, for example, you have to have, if it auto plays, you have to be able to turn it off, and you have to be able to start it up again. So I'm not sure that that's really slowing it down from a performance perspective, but you should definitely allow for somebody to manually go through the carousel if you have to have one on your page. We also do things like if you know the carousel container, when you detect keyboard usage within that container, we automatically stop it from rotating, so that it immediately becomes a manual thing if you're moving through it with the keyboard, so that you basically take a screen reader that's on that content. If it's suddenly whisked away, quite often what happens that, you know, if the node is just slidden, nice word. If the node slides out to the side, that's different than if the node is destroyed. And in some of these cases, the screen reader focus is lost, and they have to start over at the top of the page. So that's something where we want to kind of give them a little bit more control.
I think we're running the danger here of getting into implementations and explaining you how to do a certain widget. And we're all open to discussion for that. It would be wonderful to get a few questions sorted, and then we can answer offline, because right here now it would be like, do it like this or do it like that.
To answer the broader question about timing, there's language in WCAG about how long things should take, how much time you should allow for things. So that maybe gets a bit more at your question. And also, like, to me, raises a bit of a broader question, which is I'm curious how many web developers have even looked at WCAG 2? Quite a few. Cool. To me, it seems like it's a great set of guidelines for creating good user interfaces. So, for example, things like allowing error correction in forms. Like, do we not all want that? Do we not all want the form to lose all of our data if we make a single mistake? So yeah, I think the web would be better for everybody if we all followed WCAG, and this is an example of something which is in there, which we could learn about just from reading the guidelines. And of course, there's stuff that's not in there, or there's stuff that needs more information, but it's a really great place to start.
Okay, we're running out of time here a bit, so we're skipping one of the questions that I've seeded, sadly enough. We have one from Aurelia Moser here.
For the skipped person.
I skipped Dan Applequist, he can deal with it.
Okay. So I'm wondering, how do you prioritize accessibility in your workflow? And right now it seems that reactive is something you need to do, so how can we make it just the thing to do?
It's the old question of like, where's the accessibility plugin that I can put at the end of my workflow? How do you get accessibility into the workflow from the very beginning in a cutthroat environment that has not much time? Derek.
It's got to be moved earlier in the process. If it gets to the end and you're finding accessibility issues for the first time in QA, or as you're preparing it for QA, it's too late. It has to be done at the design level, and I think if you focus very loosely on design, development, and QA as kind of three important pieces, not thinking about the business side, that's important, but the focusing on the transition points, I think, is critical. So having designers talk with developers and speccing things out, not like as in the spec, but here's what my intent is with this design. And so that a design can specify things like, here's how the keyboard flow should work for this particular widget or for this page. Here's the most, even working on it together, here's the most logical source order. Looking at this wireframe and the hierarchy of content, here's the most logical source order for that. And having that stuff passed all the way down the chain to me, is one of the most critical things that would help address that, so that it happens earlier and we don't get to the end and say,
Andrew, what do you think?
This is someone else's point of view. I can't remember whose article it was, but he was talking about how the first time you do something, it is difficult and it takes you longer to do it. So if you guys can remember the first time you built a website, it was probably hard and it took you a long time. The first time you built a responsive site, it would have been, your mind might have been a bit blown. You're like, this is taking me a long time. But then the next time you do it, it's easier. The next time you do it again, it's easier. And then it just becomes normal. And it's kind of like that with accessibility. It only seems hard because it's not something you'll do day to day. But if you do invest a bit of time and effort into doing it a couple of times, your workflow will change and it just will become something you do naturally. I can't remember whose opinion that was, but I really liked it when I read it.
I completely agree with that, and I completely agree with various things that have been said before, like, for example, just try it out with a keyboard as you're doing it. I mean, the most important thing is, as Derek pointed out, to do it from the very start, from the design process, but you're all going to be dealing with stuff that already exists. And there are some things, I think Alice mentioned accessibility testing, you can't do it all mechanically, but some of it you can. And perhaps this is going to sound odd coming from me, because I'm very much reliant on me going to look at a site and finding accessibility problems with it. But there are a whole range of things that you can test mechanically. For example, does every image have an alt attribute? It's a very simple thing. Now, one of my colleagues is working on, or has developed, a tool, an API, in fact. It's going to be in beta soon. It's called Tenon, which can perform these tests that can be automated, and it will go away and perform them. And because it's a command line thing, you can make it part of your build process. So if there were two biggest things I would say is perhaps look at that, see what it can do for you, because it can be part of your build process. A human being does not need to waste their time on some of this stuff. And the other thing is make sure that you can challenge yourself to, like Christian said, take away the mouse for a while and see if you can still use your site. Some stuff like that, you can really reduce the amount of time and effort it takes by making it part of your process. And as much as possible, please do try and consider it from the design stage, from the absolute get-go. And then there's the other sorts of advice that you've heard just generally sprinkled through about testing things with a keyboard and stuff like that.
I'd like to just interject a little bit of sociology, because I know part of the issue is that it has to be a team effort across your entire team. Some people are going to value accessibility more than others. And I think it's trying to position accessibility as part of a norm, which is understanding that disabled people aren't an out-group, they're part of your in-group. So at the moment, there's a term, aversive disablism. So most people believe they're quite liberal, they don't discriminate against disabled people. But if you're designing for your group, and that group doesn't include disabled people, then you might as well be making disablist judgments, because you're still excluding. The outputs are still the same. So in that sense, it's important to sort of expand our concept of who a normal user is to include disabled people, of who we know.
Okay, we have to wrap up, so I have to thank the panel, and I'm incredibly excited about all of your interest, because having worked in accessibility and having to shout at people for years to consider accessibility, it's great that there is a new way there. It's kind of disheartening that we have to remind people about something. There seems to be a communication gap between the accessibility evangelists and the developers out there, and a lot of things can be repeated that have been said a few times, so I'm really happy about this. So take this idea, take this enthusiasm about it out there and pester as many people as possible who know about accessibility. And if you get grumpy answers, as Patrick said, we're just people too. So that just happens. So thanks very much again, and everyone.
We're going straight into the final panel. Can I have the final panelists up the front? Are you ready? So you've got your questions on paper. I do. And can I have my mic on, please? Okay, everyone. Okay, everyone, it's time for our final panel of the day. Our final panel of the day is Future Web. Oi! I always get nervous at trying to shout at people because I have a dog, and I feel like if I don't think carefully, I'm just going to shout sit.
It might work.
It might well work, actually. I am going to give you a treat afterwards, so there you are. Our final panel of the day is Future Web, and this is sort of the one I'm looking forward to the most because it's the least well-defined, and and I think it could go anywhere. So to moderate this, we have Joe Ribbin, a veteran of 3 W3C community groups, and describes himself as somewhat interested in mobile, which I think is an understatement. Joe, take it away.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So, folks, we have the privilege, the challenge, and well, yes, it is a challenge of having a very broadly scoped topic, but we're going to be exciting, lively, and vibrant, and we need you to participate in that. So, lots of interaction, please, from everybody. Let me introduce my panel first of all. I'm going from the right here. We have Andrew Spooner, who's UX evangelist at Microsoft. We have Jenny Tennyson, who is CTO at the Open Data Institute. To my left, we have Scott Jensen, who does user experience at Google. And who's next? Oh, it's Tom over there. Tom Ashworth is front-end developer over at Twitter. And Alice on the end there does user experience stuff for the Government Digital Service. I think we are... I'm so sorry. I'm carried away in my own excitement. We'll probably cover some themes that have already been covered today, but I'm hoping we'll cover them from a slightly different perspective. So we've already talked, for example, about varying device sizes and so on. But we are looking for broadening that topic out, I guess, and looking to future case. Remember, we're talking about the future, so every opinion is valid. Well, nearly every opinion. I'm trying hard to let go of that reference to being older than Make. What do you think?
Actually, is Gareth here? Is he still here? The guy who said that?
No, he ran off.
He ran off. Well, just collectively, everyone here who's over 37 would wish him to say just fuck you.
I want to, just to verify my own antiquity, I want to make sure that you understand my first build system was in fact a shoebox, which helped me to keep the punched cards in order. The other thing I want to say in this rather lengthy preamble before I introduce Jenny is that you've heard people say when they've been asked to ask their questions, this isn't what I wrote. I'm expecting that quite a few people who I call on will say, I have no idea what this even means. It bears no relation whatsoever to what I wrote down. Now, this is not... we did actually try to keep it thematically coherent, so the people who are asking the questions may have some words in that. Dan's nodding there. There are some words in your question, Dan, that you did originally write. Not next to each other and not in the same order. Right, so Jenny, can you please tell us where next?
Okay. So, can I have my slides up, please? No, maybe it's not plugged in. It's on the screen here, it's just not on the screen there.
Do you need to...
Maybe it's not plugged in.
Yeah, it's not plugged in.
That would
help. Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah.
I know, I've got it set up. You want it to mirror?
Yeah. Arrangement. Thank you, Derek. Right, sorry for that slight delay. Right, so the topic of future web is a rather broad one, the future being very much longer than the past, hopefully. God, what have I done there? Touch wood. Right. So thinking about the future web, obviously the first person to ask about where the web might go would be Chrome. Come on. This is not good. Okay. I think I might need to use it. This is using reveal.js, by the way. Thank you. We do need the future faster. Sorry about this. Derek, it's alternative.
What did you do to my computer?
Thank you. We are living in the future. Excellent, that looks much better.
Do you want to try it? Oh, it's not up on the screen now. Hang on a second.
There we go. Okie dokie, right. Yes, looks better. Right, thank you. So let's ask Timble. Now, of course, thinking about asking Timble what the future of the web holds, of course, he did his Ask Me Anything on Reddit, where he was asked what was one of the things that you never anticipated about the internet, and famously replied, kittens. So in terms of predicting what's going to happen in the future web, I can predict that there will still be kittens on the web and pussies too. But I want to focus on three themes, three trends that I think are going to be important as we go forward as web developers, and look at those in terms of what that means for us when we're developing web applications. Those three themes are going to be more sensitivity around our personal information, more data being available, and, as we've touched on many times today, more devices. So, more sensitivity, first of all. Ed Snowden. One of the things that has happened recently that has changed the way in which we think about the web is the revelations around that Ed Snowden came about what the NSA is looking at, what GCHQ is looking at. And I found this on Wikipedia, a fantastic little diagram. SSL added and removed here. This is the stuff that we can get into, guys, at the back end of Google, where there's no encryption and we have free reign. What does this mean in terms of how we design our systems, our web applications? What does it mean in terms of these revelations, this thinking about where our private information is going? What does that mean for us? Well, there's loads of policy implications, loads of things that we can think of at a legislative level or a policy level. But there are also some technical ones. I'm on the technical architecture group at the W3C, and one of the things that has come up several times without any kind of resolution or in-depth thinking is what we do around permissions on the web, where how do we balance the need for you to know that you are being looked at through your video camera on your laptop with it not being right so much in your face that you cannot interact with whatever the application is. How do we balance up the need to request on a case-by-case basis information about your location with the irritation of being requested on a case-by-case basis about your location? How do we get around these terrible kinds of permission interfaces that everybody just clicks through and ignores? Everybody being everybody who doesn't wear a tinfoil hat, that is. So that's one set of kind of questions. How do we handle those permissions when we have lots of ways of tracking us? Another area that I wanted to raise was how do we move away from these centralized services that are so vulnerable to that are a single point of failure, if you like, in our private data. So I'm particularly interested in a couple of activities that are going on around this, around unhosted web apps, the idea of having a web application over here that operates on data over here, and you can control how your data gets accessed by that web app. It doesn't actually hold all your data itself. And also the work of Redecentralize, which explores a lot of these issues, and I'd encourage you to have a look at. How do we get to a web that isn't as centralized as it currently is because of these sensitivities that we have about our personal data being collected in huge databases which are vulnerable to attack? So that was my first area. Second area is about data. Now, so far during the day, the focus has really been on what happens within a browser context. Where I work at the Open Data Institute, all I hear about is data. All I hear about is smart cities and the data that you can get from devices and sensors within a road network in smart cities. This is smart city logo land, right? We talk about home automation and the extra information we can get about our homes, interactions with home systems, sensors, more data coming in from our home systems. We talk about quantified self, wearable computing that monitors us constantly, that provides streams and streams of data. We talk about open data, naturally, at the Open Data Institute, more government data being made available, also from companies, data being made available that we can all use. We talk about big data, massive amounts of fast-moving, variable data. I love the way that in my search for big data, see that McDonald's sign? Why? I don't know. Anyway, data. So we talk about medical data, defense data, Dicker data, whatever that is. Morning data, noon data, afternoon data, night data. Everything is data. So what does this mean for the web when we have so much more data being passed around? There's so much more streaming data, so much more big data. HTTP as a protocol is not good for this kind of streaming. It's not good for these kinds of big files. So what other protocols are we using? What other protocols do we need? And how do we make them play nicely with the web? Okay, how do we make them play well with HTML pages and HTTP? The web was made for documents. So is JSON the pinnacle of data on the web? Is JSON really all that we need for expressing data on the web? I don't think so. The other question I'd like to raise is, what does a native native data browser look like? What happens currently when you have data that's made available on the web is that you have to create your own kind of component, your own kind of visualization. We have things like this, which are data tables, JavaScript plugin that makes everything that streams data in, that makes it sortable, filterable, pageable, and so on. But what about moving to more integrated data and documents using the kinds of technologies within D3? What does this mean for us on the web? What kinds of components, what kinds of web components could we build that natively work with data? Those are the kinds of questions that I think are interesting for the future. Third area, more devices. This is the area that we touched on loads today. So we have a browser that stopped working again. Come on. More devices. Give me it. Come on. Whoops. Okay, so we have more devices that don't work. That is completely interaction. It's fine, it's fine. I know how to get through it quickly. Okay, more devices. Right. Phones, tablets. Yes, that's a Windows tablet. TVs, watches, fridges, cars. And all of these devices have differences in their size, in their resolution, in their connectivity, in their processing power, in their modes of interaction, as we've already talked about, and in their context of use. Huge variety, massive variety of ways in which we as humans will interact with the web. And of course, that means that we need this like responsive design plus, right? Not only responsive layout, but responsive images, responsive interactions, changing based on the devices that we use, responsive storage, different ways of storing the information, and knowing whether you're going to go on and offline intermittently, or whether you're going to have a constant internet connection, for example, will change the way in which we design our web applications. Right, and a final thought. We're currently dominated by 4 particular web browsers and fewer rendering engines. Well, okay. And perhaps we should be dominated by one more. Yeah, all right. So, okay. It's Bling. It's the same. So, rendering engine. So, my closing question would be, are we agile enough, right? Have we got enough small pieces loosely joined to enable us to adjust to a changing future? Can the web that we know it be disrupted by the next best thing? Or have we built something that is too big to be taken down? Okay, so thank you.
Woo! Thank you very much, Jenny. I anticipate a future in which Jenny will give a presentation using web technology with fewer than 3 different browsers. But I don't expect it'll come soon. Right. Jenny, thank you. That was great. And hopefully we can follow up on some of your themes through some of the questions that we have put through the ringer. For the final time today, at least in this role, I'm going to call on Andrew Betts. This time to read a question that he had nothing to do with.
That is very true, actually. And I have no more questions, I promise you. What is the role of the web in the world of wearables with no screen?
Okay, so the question is, what is the role of the web in a world with wearables with no screen? This is a reference to the fact that the web is primarily a visual thing in its output, at least. We've talked about different input modalities. What about different output modalities? Jenny, do you want to kick us off on this one?
Oh, right, okay. Just recovering.
Oh, I'm sorry. Jenny,
okay.
Calm down.
Right. It's one of my bugbears that we focus on browsers, we focus on screens, and we don't think about the other ways in which all sorts of agents might interact on the web. And I think wearables is just one kind of example of this. But there are lots of other kinds of agents that we need to be thinking about and understand that they live on the web too, and they consume web content too. Wearables, you've got a difference in input modality, but you've also got a difference in output modality, which I think changes the way in which we need to think about how we design our pages in the same way as we talked about accessibility issues in the last session. Sorry, that wasn't very...
No, that's great. Thank you. Alice, I know that you've done a lot of work in the Internet of Things. How does this strike you in that context?
Well, I mean, I think it's the web is going to continue in the way it currently does in a world without screens, because, as Jenny said, there are already plenty of things that don't have screens, and there'll be new things that don't have screens, and some of those will be objects that we currently understand, like watches,
that have a sort of additional, have been elevated by having the web put into them, but then there might be some completely new invented things that are a middle ground that you would never have thought about before you were able to put the web into sort of stuff. And there are, you know, like I used to work for Berg, and so we made Little Printer, and Little Printer is, we made a mistake by calling it Little Printer because it's not, well, it is a printer, but that's not like its primary function. And you would never really want that with Little Printer without the internet. And in that way, it's sort of a new product rather than like an internet fridge or something like that. But Little Printer doesn't have a screen unless you count the receipt paper that it prints on as a screen, which it, you know, we mischievously say it is sometimes.
Thanks for that. Go ahead, Scott.
I could just poke fun at the community a little bit, though, because right now I don't think that that the web community even can get its head wrapped around the web on a watch, let alone a web not on a screen at all.
Yeah.
There's this, I think the web has never recovered from the fact that screens started getting smaller.
Or bigger.
No, I mean, they continually got bigger, and it basically just immediately just didn't worry about things. And then when it reversed direction, we collectively lost our minds. And we still haven't recovered from that. And so this idea that we have to have one size fits all works great as long as you're willing to scroll everything 20 pages. But if you want to have I hate to get into the web app versus web page thing because it's a waste of, you know, but the fact is that we are trying to make things that are more interactive, and the web has not got its head wrapped around that quite yet. And so I do think we have a lot of soul searching to do to figure out what interaction means on multiple devices.
Okay, so to summarize some of the points here, what we're saying is we haven't even got to grips with what we've got, but I would come back and say, hey, but you haven't seen anything yet, so we better hurry up and make up our minds about what we're going to do. I can see Remy on the queue. Let me take Remy and come back to you.
Yes, this is kind of linked to the question I had before, but I mean, you mentioned kind of poking fun at the web. I mean, I don't get it, right? I don't get how my phone is of the web. It can, I think, talk over TCP/IP, and it can talk to a web server, but in a proprietary format. It's not. There's no webbiness that I can see there. There's no way of me getting into it.
I'm going to cut you off there because we're going to come back to this as a topic later. So I'll let you back in.
That's a thing.
Okay. Fascinating though your point was, we will be coming back to it. Does it qualify as a web device? It's not a purely syntactic argument, I don't think. Tom?
Well, I think we as a web community have good things to say to the people who are building these wearable devices. We may not be able to put our technology stack on them, so you're not going to find a headless web browser running on a Fitbit. But we can say if you make URLable resources available and connected to each other, we know that's a good thing. We can point out to the people who are building these things that has some really positive benefits. And if we give things URLs and we make them addressable and we make them accessible, even if they, even if it's JSON and not HTML, but we use the principles of the web and to some extent the internet, then I think we can have a really positive impact as the web community on whatever comes over the next few years in terms of wearable devices and things that don't have screens.
Okay, Andrew.
Yeah, I think to call inherent to the web is the presentation format, that presentation layer. So to think of the web without a screen, I think is a little bit weird.
Completely disagree.
Carry on. That's good.
Andrew, you yourself were talking about music and notation and so on. What's wrong with a web of music?
Nothing's wrong with a web of music, but I think we've got all of this data in a particular format that we can access, and we can use web languages in order to talk to data and in order to talk to devices, but I don't see it as the web on those devices.
Jenny, go on.
So the reason that I disagree is that for me then the web is that the main definition of the web is use of HTTP. It isn't the use of HTML. And if you count the use of HTTP, you can be sending data over HTTP, which needn't be shown on a screen, which could be interacted with through a wearable device or in any other kind of way. That if we tie the web as only being HTML, I think we make a mistake.
Yeah, I'm not getting into the protocols, but what the web is is, to me, it has a presentation there, and it's something very visual. But we can certainly use the content, and we can use the languages that we've got in order to interact with devices. But maybe we're getting crossed.
Right, okay, I think we could continue on this, and I'm very sorry to everybody who's on the queue here, but we are going to move on to the next topic now, because we've got too much to cover. We just have. I am going to call, again, possibly for the final time today, Christopher, you've been an active participant. I hope I didn't mangle your question beyond your ability to read it.
Yes, I mean, if you allow me to just preface this, the reason I'm kind of asking this question is I've actually recently had experience with this, but also when we talk about the future, we focus a little bit too much on the tech side and not about the audience side. So basically my question is, the future of the web will see a rising importance in optimizing sites for the use in China and working with their national firewall. Many popular embeddable services, such as YouTube, are blocked over there. How do we accommodate different national attitudes to privacy, sensitive content, and inappropriate content, and so on? And there's also the technological barriers to dealing with it as well.
Jenny, I'm going to ask you to leap in here again, because this is, I think, directly keying off one of your principal points.
And I think it was also because nobody else wanted to touch it with a barge pole. On the internet, then the typical way in which we move around those barriers is that we subvert them. That tends to be what happens. We tend to work around those kinds of issues. I don't have direct experience of the issues in China, and I can't really speak to them. I think that the issues about how we internationally come up with some kind of understanding about how when we have lots of different laws around privacy, around data protection, and so on, how we internationally handle that is a very interesting question. I've seen people from Africa talk about wanting to have legislation in their countries that explicitly precludes anybody looking at data within servers that are in their countries to make them a more attractive option for people who are building web applications to use servers in their country, for example. So we might start to see an arms race between different nationalities as they try to provide a more interesting web environment for people to use, maybe. The other kinds of things that I think are interesting, if you think about what Timbal said at the 25th anniversary of the web just the other week, talking about a Bill of Rights for internet users, whether we should have a right to use the internet, whether we should have a right to use it with particular levels of understanding about what our privacy should be, what access we should have to content on the web. Or the other kind of idea that I've heard floating around is whether we should have a Geneva Convention type of thing, where we know that there are going to be states that block us from accessing certain kinds of content, but should we have an international understanding about the limits of that blocking that we internationally agree on? I think these are all really interesting questions. I think that we're only at the beginning of starting to have those conversations, particularly with policymakers who really don't understand any of this at all.
And that's quite scary, really, isn't it?
I think we also have to look at this question from another point of view, which is, actually this is a moot point if the web is not viable in any particular country. So, for example, I won't call them developing nations because their economies are bigger than the UK's, but in countries like Brazil or, say, China or India, we have to ask, is the web actually a viable platform there at the moment? If I, for example, worked for a social network, and let's say I work for Facebook and I want to get more users in a country like one of the ones I just mentioned. I've got a range of technologies that are available to me, and honestly, as web people, we have to say, you know what, the web does not win in that battle. Native wins in that battle. Low-powered Android wins that battle. And
dear.
Actually, okay,
right.
I'll give you Firefox OS as well. But you have to admit that I think for a big company, if you're going to invest inner technology right now, low-powered Android phones, particularly if you're heading into those markets, are a very good option. We are missing certain key elements of the technology stack that will enable us to make gains in those places. There were quite a few questions in the moderator actually about...
right, I'm going to cut you off there because I think that you've done your advertising spiel. Thank you very much for that. Can we go to Robert Daly, who's on the queue?
Hi, we currently think of one device, one user, but with car OSs and basically the giant touchscreens that will have multiple users using the same app at the same time, how do we deal with, say, a driver and a passenger using the same app in a car at the same time without switching user accounts, or, you know, as in, how do we deal with multiple people interacting with the web?
Or indeed multiple people on single people on multiple devices, which is the other side of that problem. So do you want to take that one, Scott?
I actually would add that. I feel like that's exactly the issue the web has right now, is that we've been so enamored with one device and one screen that that's just our entire myopia. I even go even further that one screen has to, by the way, look and feel as much like an iPhone as possible. But I'm being a little editorial at that point. But I do think that the web needs to be exploring these kinds of things. So what would it mean to have something on my watch which then entices me to pull out my phone and allows me then to continue the experience? I don't think we're considering that. And it's something that, frankly, I think the web is most powerful at playing with.
Okay, sorry, I'm going to have to skip to Guy, and then we'll move on to the next topic.
I just want to kind of get back to the country question and say that I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that the web needs to adapt to those countries. I think to a large extent the countries need to adapt to the web, and it's sort of a force to be reckoned with, and Twitter and other platforms have already demonstrated that multiple times over the past few years. And I think when you talk about the future of the web, it's very much possible that the future of the web is the openness of it, and it's kind of the government's problem to sort of figure out how do they navigate within that world. So the intent is about getting data from one place to the other, privacy concerns around that, et cetera. But
yeah, I agree with that.
I'm really sorry about this. We were actually going to go light on the allotted time for that, but we've run out of time on it, despite thinking we were not going to spend as much on it as we might have done. Oh well. Right, next topic. Daniel Applequist, because I'm much nicer than Christian Heilman, I'm going to give you your question.
Okay. There we go. Oh, this isn't what I wrote. No. So in its march towards increasing sophistication, and I think this question, parenthetically, this question kind of goes back to the more display browser-oriented web that we've been talking about for. It's not to discount the importance of the data-oriented web, which I think is also important. But in its march towards increasing sophistication, is the web losing touch with being easy to learn, and therefore accessible to a very broad authorship community? And I'm going to add one more parenthetical statement. I think this relates to the whole meme that's going on right now about teaching kids to code and getting kids, and especially young people, engaged in development. How do we get them engaged in the web easily?
Okay, thank you, Dan. I'm going to re-paraphrase your question back to another fork of the question, if you like, which is, it used to be terribly easy to write a basic web page. It was pretty shit, but it was very easy to do. That was an on-ramp. That point has been made earlier today. But in order to be competitive or to provide a better user experience, things have got a lot more complicated. Have they got disproportionately complicated in order to achieve the objectives of being more sophisticated than they used to be?
No. Yeah.
No. Right.
Like, so here's
we can deal with this.
Okay,
No, right.
You can, like, back in the day, it was still quite hard to get a web page onto a server, and not a lot of people were interested in doing it proportionately because it was quite a lot of effort, because there wasn't this sort of corpus of like help and tutorials and stuff. And now you can get very, very far and do very cool stuff without knowing basically anything. And like that may be a good thing or a bad thing, but like it's not, to say that we've made it too complicated for people is really doing people a massive disservice. These people that are like, oh, I can't be bothered, they always existed and they're still around and they still can't be bothered. And then there are people who can be bothered and they also are still being served by what we have. And you can just go further. And people who will say, oh, but it's possible for people to make like terrible mistakes and do really dangerous things, that's fine. Those people are going to learn really quickly how to be better. And that's brilliant too. So this kind of like, yeah,
They'll learn really quickly, but possibly with disastrous consequences.
Well,
I mean, you know, I use this analogy, which is putting a chainsaw in the hands of a 6-year-old. Either they learn, or well, you know, they don't.
So I teach people every week, mostly beginners. In fact, people who live in London, CodeBar.io, minority people in tech, we're trying to promote, particularly women. So if you've got free time on Wednesdays, please come to that. But I teach people every Wednesday, and I see this a lot. I see people who are coming new to HTML and new to CSS, and absolutely it is possible for them to go from 0 and in an hour and a half have a huge smile on their face because they've just created their first website. There's absolutely no reason to believe that that's fading away.
Yeah, and also, Joe, I mean, when you started programming and doing things initially, I mean, in CSS you say had an editor, so you could actually write a page on that. And then when you wanted to do anything dynamic, did you see a Perl script that executed in a bash shell? Are you sure that we can do anything more dangerous than that?
I think we're talking. Okay, valid, Andrew.
I think as any technology matures, we realise that some of the things that we used to do that were quite difficult to do, we try and simplify those. If I think back when I started on the web, just trying to get someone to just trying to get data into a form and save that onto a server somewhere, that was actually quite a complicated task. It was it took us a long time to do that. It was a very expensive thing to do. There's a lot of simple tools out there that allow people to do that quite easily now. And so whilst that's an easy thing to do, I think it means that some people don't understand what it is that what's actually going on in the background. But then, do you need to know what's going on in the background? I look at my...
Hopefully not.
Hi. I just want to add to that a little bit and say I've just recently started doing Code Club. So I teach kids as young as 5.
How are you getting on? No, sorry.
One day I hope to make a career out of it. But I teach kids as young as like 5 or 6 how to do programming, and the facility with which they pick up quite sophisticated concepts is incredible. And I think with the low barrier to entry that the web provides, I don't think we're in any danger of making that too complex at all.
Okay.
I think Linda has just arrived from Code Club as we were speaking about it. So, yeah, without wishing to put words in her mouth about what the mission of Code Club is, I mean, it really fills a gap in education that does exist, and there is a problem with that. And so when you're talking about, you know, maybe you're talking about coming to the web as like, you know, a teenager who is looking to make their first web page, and then there's Code Club, who is sort of enabling kids at a much younger age to get involved with technology and think about and programming in a way that just the education system is.
And since we're talking about the future of the web, really, groups like Code Club and Young Rewired State are making the future of the web, which is the people who make the web. So we should invest in those.
Okay, thank you. We do need to push on here because I think we've probably only got time for 2 more things if we're going to stick to our timing. So Daniel, no danger there. Okay. Moving on. From Ed S. This is Ed Snowden. Yes, this was a combination of yours and someone else's. So it starts, just to check, it starts, is the web.
Okay, so I was given this to ask on behalf of Ed Soden, or Souden, could be. But I think it's the question that Remy perhaps wanted to ask, and it's kind of been bubbling under a few of the conversations as well. It goes like this. Is the web going to grow into an all-encompassing platform for all future computing? Is there any area which will be spared? Or, by contrast, is the future of the web just providing APIs for native applications to be built?
Thank you. So this is a question about what are the limits of the web? What is the definition of the word web? I don't think we probably want to go that way, but you know, you guys started having a little bit of a hammer and tongs about that earlier. Would you like to continue that in the context of this question? So, will the web grow into an all-encompassing computational platform? Jenny, you say no because some things that are inherently web-like, like HTTP, are not suitable.
Yeah, so I think the basic how I would define the web, which would be about the use of HTTP and the use of resources identified by URLs, takes us a long way, but there are some aspects of particularly data flows on the internet that don't use web protocols and should not use web protocols, and we need to be thinking outside of the HTTP as the only protocol that we ever use on the internet.
Andrew.
Is this also about languages and how we can extend languages to other?
You can make it
platforms, because thank you. I see the web. We've invested so much time in it. We've invested so much time putting the content into a format that we can access, and we can do so much more with languages like JavaScript nowadays that they're actually starting to stand up to other languages. So the web can exist in almost anything. If I think about some of the development work I do at the moment, using JavaScript to access the same APIs that I can do through C++, or I could do through C#, when creating applications for Windows 8, for instance. I'm using the same web technologies and the same web languages.
So are you saying that the distinction is a bogus distinction in some ways? You're saying everything flows into everything else?
I think it can exist in places where we don't have it currently, yes.
Remy, I'm hoping this was adjacent to the point that you were making.
No, I don't.
Absolutely nothing to do with it.
It's not so much nothing to do with it. I don't think the web will be everything, and I don't think it will just be APIs.
So I think, I agree with what you're saying. I think there's a lot of hype around the Internet of Things. There's a lot of hype around smartwatches and all that stuff. And I think there are a lot of companies that are doing a lot of figuring out through doing at the moment. And what we'll find in 10 years, well, no, not 10 years, 5 years, is the web will be in some stuff and it'll make a lot of sense and everybody will be like, check out my cool web-enabled thing. And then it won't be in other stuff and people will be like, remember when we tried to put the internet in fucking fridges? That was madness. And but there's a lot of hype and a lot of marketing stuff that makes all of this seem like people are seriously thinking about this when actually they're just figuring stuff out and, some of it is bad and some of it is...
I seriously challenge that in the sense, and go back to the audience in a second, in the sense that I'm old enough to have said 15 years ago, do you know what, people are going to be using these devices here to do all kinds of cool stuff on the move, and people said, yeah, we'll wait to see that. So I think that expressing scepticism about the direction that these technologies will take is a potentially dangerous route to take.
Let's not have any scepticism then.
Yeah.
That wasn't my point.
Believe me, I write JavaScript all day, every day, and quite frankly, I do not want JavaScript on a pacemaker. I do not want I just, if you said to me, look, here's a web-enabled thing that's going in your body, I would tell you to fucking write it.
Go ahead.
We actually have, there's actually examples of what we tried to do once when there was Nokia Series 40 thing. We tried to do an interpreter for doing things running on a device that basically you couldn't even fit a JavaScript interpreter on, because I don't know if you remember, but JavaScript, apart from having obvious limitations regarding how we handle numbers, etc., requires quite a bit of stack, etc. And we ended up doing the first gadget engine thing that we built in this company in Scheme. In a Scheme because it was the smaller interpreter that could fit in approximately 4K. Right? So there would be things, as we were saying, that basically you cannot use the HTML, CSS for actually making your interface simpler, and you cannot use JavaScript to kind of reuse what you had been doing because literally there's no space. So not only because of the whole asynchronous thing, but because technically some of these things in the Internet of Things are not even going to have a stack to run JavaScript on, nor to use HTTP for that matter.
Christian, you had a word you wanted to interject, and then we're going to probably have to move on.
One thing is what amazes me is we talk about HTTP, but then we're actually using a system here that uses WebSockets, and we're using a system that uses WebRTC and has peer-to-peer connections. It could even be encrypted between two computers so that companies starting with N and ending with SA couldn't actually listen to us. I find it also interesting that when I started on the web, what I loved most about it is that I can use whatever I want to actually start connecting with it. And now we're talking about smartwatches, glasses that cost $1,500, basically toys for the Western world to be the future of the web. And to me, the future of the web lies in, as you said, emerging markets with more people than we have. And fixing that to gadgets that are closed in one environment is, to me, the wrong way of making the future of the web.
Okay, a closing comment from the panel here. Scott, have you got something to say on this?
Well, I'm intrigued with how we want this future to go, because there's clearly the discussion of how the standards bodies work, but I would argue that the vast majority of the conversations that I tend to have with people is all about, well, how can you make this web page scroll on a small screen? And so I think to a certain extent we've trapped ourselves in our own paradigm, which is that these are just scrolling web pages. And I think that there's so much more the web can do. And for example, the previous question about multi-displays, I don't want to aspire to be what the iPhone was 5 years ago. And I think the web can do so much more than that.
Isn't it a big issue that we still say it should look the same everywhere? That's what I always have to fight clients for.
This is a little off topic,
I don't
guys.
agree with that, but yeah. Sorry?
So I'm sorry, but we're going to close that. It's my job. I quite enjoy it, actually. Right. We have a final question which is going to set us, I think, down the path, actually, that you were on just now, Scott. So we'll let you continue on that one. From Andre Behrens.
Hi, this is Andre's question. Web developers and even corporations that are outside the browser vendor community have the feeling of being a prisoner to decisions others make with often limited means to address certain problems. Who should be determining the future of the web and how?
So, who should be determining the future of web and how?
Well, I assume this is the whole Extensible Web Manifesto discussion.
It can be.
It can be. I still feel that our biggest issue is our own myopia of what we think is important, because the vast majority of this community is just trying to figure out and argue about apps versus native. And so to me, I would like the web community to start to figure out a way to experiment with these new things. Like, how would I write a web app to work across multiple displays? I'd have to roll everything from scratch. And I just don't think that we're talking about ways to encourage that kind of experimentation. It seems to be so standards-driven now that we've lost the ability to kind of do stupid shit, and I'd like to do more of that.
Okay. You carry on doing more stupid shit. I'll talk to someone else. Sorry. Jenny, people, the view expressed here is that people don't have a sufficient voice in the process.
So I think the web is what we build. It's what we make. It's through experimentation. And that we have a responsibility, if we want our voice to be heard, to step up and shout. So I think that in terms of standardization, I think the W3C has done a lot to try and open up discussion through adding community groups, for example, over the past 3 years. But I do think that there is a massive gap between the developers that are in this room here and the majority of web developers out there who probably do feel that they have no role in the conversation.
So can I just ask for a little straw poll here? Out of everybody in this room here, who has actually, or who does, participate in particularly the W3C process? Okay. So who...
Spec or specifically W3C?
Specifically W3C, I think, since we're talking about the web, and I guess I'm making the web and W3C a kind of, well, it needn't be. So is the W3C the future guardian of web? Well, that's another question, I guess. Someone could ask it. What I think is the view that is expressed here is that that's not working particularly well.
But I think everybody in this room, everybody who contacts a browser vendor and asks them to fix a bug, asks them to add a feature, you've all got a voice in this. They're all listening. I know that there was, I can't remember the exact numbers, X thousand of bugs reported to the Internet Explorer team. And there's a team of hundreds of people sitting there listening to those, implementing those changes. So if you're sending your requests in, there's people listening to it. And ultimately, I think everyone in this room has a chance to input into where it goes. I
would ask if you've had experience of that, because just for some examples, there's a bug in Firefox from about 2002, 2003 to do with fragment identifiers in iframes. It was opened in 2003. I bumped it a year and a half ago. Somebody else had bumped it about 3 years before that. Nothing from Mozilla. In terms of Internet Explorer, I don't know who to talk to. I don't know how I can get at those people. Apple, we all know the story there.
You're right.
And for example, when the developer tooling guys were up, both of the people who represented people who were working on these things, when asked how do we contribute, kind of shrunk up and wrung their hands. I just don't think it's true that these are kind of friendly environments that we can get to.
Connect.microsoft.com, where you can submit your requests, and there's paid Microsoft employees who will then respond to you and say, right, yes, we know about this, or say, this isn't a feature we're interested in implementing. And you'll get a response from a human being through that, and there's loads of people in there who are responding to that.
Let's go to the audience on this. We've got someone at the back, we've got Guy, and then, hang on a second, but let's go to the back first.
Hi. I'm kind of biased on this, but I think that out of the 4 rendering engines that we saw at the beginning, 3 of them are open source. So basically, people can either work on the engines themselves or find someone who will do this for them. And the reason I'm biased because I'm currently working. I started a crowdfunding effort yesterday to add feature the picture element to Blink. So, and I think that the future should have more of that. More people adding features to the open source rendering engine.
Okay. Coming forward in the room, Guy.
I think that's a pretty high barrier to entry, though, isn't it? For most web developers.
Yes, that is.
That, as a suggestion, it seems like.
Yeah, I mean, if the Sensible Web Manifesto has been mentioned. If we work towards that ideal where we expose more of the kind of primitives that are there in the browsers but we currently have no access to, if we expose them to developers, then I think we stand a chance of being able to at least iterate more quickly towards an API that we can then standardize.
I think given the choice between downloading and, patching Chrome myself or just working around a problem, I would work around it, pragmatically, as a developer.
My comment is actually a little different. It's a little different to sort of, in general, the notion of where does the web evolve, and I think we're losing sight of the server side. Like, we keep talking about the clients and those components, but I think the future of the web lies a lot with the services consumed on it, and I think clearly all these things and all these devices are part of the technology, but what you can do on the web, especially in the developing world, or in access to banking or facilities or payments via the phone, or ordering your groceries or calling a cab, all of those components I think are a big part of the future of the web. So the fact that it might still be HTML, or maybe we're not evolving it, is sometimes less critical versus the creativity or the just disruptions that happen on the business side of it, on the server side of it.
Okay, can we drop the 1 row forwards, I think? Oh, okay, 2 rows forwards.
Thank you. In terms of having an input, which is what Andrew was talking to about getting in touch with people, I found an inconsistency in SVG. I wrote a blog post about it. I managed to get in touch with one of the editors of the SVG spec. I showed him the thing. He's updating the SVG spec to fix that thing. It does happen. It does work. It is out there, and you can get involved in it.
Okay. Go right to the back, and then we'll start to close down.
So we can have examples of times when community input has worked. What we need is an example of when it hasn't, right? When the will of the community has not been exerted over browser vendors. So maybe an example of that might be DRM. An example might be DRM, where it's going in browsers, and generally speaking, that's not what people want.
Okay, fine. I want to ask Natasha, who's sitting right in the front here, and put her on the spot, because I know that she has something interesting to say about when people are invited to take part, they don't.
What, to W3C in specific?
Yes.
Well, I've been very fortunate with contributing to W3C. I co-chair a group, and I'm actually filling Joe's shoes right now, which is pretty tough, but given all I've got.
Not very
but
pleasant,
we need people to help out, and we're so grateful if people want to help out. And we know there's a membership issue there, but if you want to help out on what we're doing in the web group, then please come and speak to us. There's lots of the W3C guys are moving to using open tools like GitHub and And Twitter, we have a Twitter account, and of course the W3C is open anyway. So if you want to contribute, you can, and please come and speak to me about that later at the party. I'll be very happy to speak to you about that.
Thanks, Natasha. Okay, so the answer to the question, Tom, do you have something to add there?
Yeah, the mention of DRM is interesting. It's not an area I know anything about, so I'm not going to speak specifically to DRM, but the idea of people who have a vested interest in that kind of technology encroaching on, say, issues of net neutrality is something that I think is really important for us to talk about. I mean, if we're talking about the future of the web, we're talking about a situation where I have to pay, my ISP for a group of websites that I'm allowed to visit, and I have to extend that package, for just $5.99 a month to get access to this other search engine or this, this website that wasn't on their original list, and they couldn't, there was some kind of hostility between the two parties or whatever, and
we
there's
had
a bigger
a question that we had to skip exactly on this topic, I'm afraid.
But there's a bigger community that needs to be involved in that. The web community is a small part of the group of people who are involved in ensuring we keep the kind of net or maintain the kind of net neutrality that we wish to have. And it's not my area of expertise, but I sometimes feel like we sort of close ourselves in and say, well, let's keep the web bit of this good, the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, that stack. Let's keep this good. As long as we look after this, everything else will be fine. Sometimes I wish we could take a step back and say, well, you know what, maybe we could stop worrying about that for a bit and say, let's get the people who work on the networking hardware and who do all these other aspects and bring us all together to make sure we can, going forward, keep the web and the internet in the way we'd like it to be.
Okay. Thank you. Now, this is unscripted. Alice, and down the line. In 3 words, then, to close this out here. What is the future of the web?
I don't know.
Tom. What an excellent response from Alice. Brilliant.
Kids. Freedom, help.
Scott?
I don't know.
Lots of arguing.
Andrew, I'm going to give the privilege of being last.
Oh, I'd just say connected. Just
connected.
Everything connected.
Okay, Jenny?
Re-decentralization, just because I like that word. And data.
And
That's
data.
only 2.
Okay. Thank you very much to our panel.
Thanks, Joe. So, believe it or not, that is it for today. Can I have my slides? There we are. So, I'm just going to keep you just for a few minutes longer just to do a bit of wrap up. So, we have a few prizes to give out to people, and we have some money to donate to Code Club, and then we have a party to go to. So we'll start with the prizes. OnSlide hasn't worked for us very well today, so I updated the slide. Hang on a second. I think I have to reload the presentation. There we go. Okay, so I've changed this around a bit because we didn't have the data from OnSlide, so we've just gone with what people were saying on Twitter, and we picked some of the contributions that were some of our favorites. So the first one, I have to say, is someone who works for me, but it is independent because it wasn't my choice, so I'm going to claim that as fair. Oh, no, except I put it in the wrong order. So, so Florian, who doesn't work for me, but I thought was one of the standout contributors on Twitter today. So are you here somewhere? You are brilliant. Okay, well, come and get a phone.
Awesome.
We also ran out of Microsoft bags, so it's a massive phone. So the other contributor I thought did a brilliant job of interpreting what was being said today and turned it into some really sort of inspiring stuff on Twitter was Ada. Well done, Ada. You can actually have the box and the other stuff that goes with it. Cool. I did think there were some others which I really wanted to give some prizes to, but we didn't have any more phones. We do have some great T-shirts though that say "I have standards." So, Mariette, are you here? Would you like a T-shirt?
Thank you.
Have a T-shirt. And we'll have some more of those to give out later at the party. So this is something we've done since the beginning of Edge. We actually show everyone who comes to the conference exactly how we made all our money and what we spent it on. So we made £21,950 from ticket sales and from 3 sponsors. And we spent £12,029 on various things. So we'll be donating £9,921 to Code Club. So I'm really pleased to say that Linda Sandvig from Code Club, well, actually the founder of Code Club, is here to say a few words. So Linda, would you like to?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to say thank you. So yeah, we teach primary school children how to code every week. Currently, just over 32,000 kids in the UK. Are there any volunteers in the room? Yay! Oh man, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, we can do it without you. So in the last year, we've gone to 2,100 clubs across the UK, from like the tip of Cornwall to the Shetland Islands. So that's pretty amazing. We are currently teaching Scratch, web development, Python, Arduino, and we're hiring a head of curriculum, so hopefully you can get more stuff out soon. We also done a crowdfunding platform with Hubbub so that clubs can get hardware into their schools, so we can get more of that maker movement happening. And yeah, we also just launched Code Club Pro, which is teacher training for all those terrified primary school teachers who have to start teaching computing in September. So yeah, that's what we've been up to. Oh yeah, and someone did some trickery with some spreadsheet and found out that it costs about £100 per code club per year to run. But that keeps going down as we get more. So yeah, that's what the money goes to. Thanks
very much. Okay. So the final thing is, does anyone want to do this again? If you do, then come to San Francisco in September. And we'll be hosted by Adobe on September the 20th. And we'll be releasing tickets for that next month. So let's go to the party. This is how to get there. If you want to walk, if you want to take the tube, then just go one stop north on the Victoria line from Victoria, and it's a short walk from there. And all the directions are also on the hub, so if you want to look it up, edgeconf.com/hub. Thank you very much.
Can I just suggest that we give Andrew a big up here?
So yeah, go on, have a party.